You hear them before you see them. A low rumble that starts at the edge of the horizon, growing louder, closer, until the ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. Then they appear. Thousands of riders moving as one organism across the plain, their composite bows already drawn, arrows nocked and ready. You've heard the stories from the east. Entire cities reduced to ash. Armies that outnumbered them 10 to 1 scattered like leaves before a storm. And now they're here, coming for you, coming for everything you've ever known. But what you don't realize yet, what none of them realize, is that this time something is about to change. Before we dive deeper into this moment that would reshape the future of an entire continent, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below. It genuinely amazes me how a story from nearly 8 centuries ago can bring together people from every corner of the globe. And if you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to uncover one of history's most misunderstood turning points. The year is 1241, and Europe is facing an existential threat unlike anything in its history. The Mongol Empire, having already conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome did in 400, has turned its gaze westward. Under the brilliant tactical mind of Subutai, one of history's most underappreciated military geniuses, an invasion force estimated between 60,000 and 80,000 strong has crashed through the Carpathian Mountains and into the heart of medieval Christendom. This isn't a raiding party. This is a systematic campaign of conquest, executed with terrifying precision. Within weeks, they've already achieved what seemed impossible. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11th, they destroyed the Hungarian army so completely that contemporary chronicles describe the Dio River running red with blood for 3 days. 2 days later, at Legnica in Poland, they annihilated a combined force of Polish knights and Teutonic crusaders, reportedly constructing a pyramid from the ears of the fallen. For those watching from the castles of Vienna, Prague, and even distant Venice, the question wasn't if the Mongols would reach them. It was when. And yet, within 2 years, this unstoppable force would withdraw. Not just retreat, but effectively abandon their Western ambitions forever. In December 1241, the great Khan Gedai, third son of Genghis Khan and ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, died in Karakoram, thousands of miles to the east. According to traditional narrative, Batu Khan and his generals immediately packed up their conquest and rushed home to participate in the selection of a new Khan. Case closed. Succession crisis saves Europe. But there's a problem with this neat explanation. Gedai died in December. The Mongols didn't leave Hungary until the summer of 1242, more than 6 months later. If the political situation was so urgent, why did they linger? Why did they spend those months consolidating their hold on conquered territories, setting up administrative structures, and even launching probing attacks further west? And here's the real question that shatters the political explanation entirely. If internal Mongol politics was the decisive factor in 1241, then what happened in 1285? When they came back? The second Mongol invasion of Hungary is one of history's most revealing controlled experiments. For decades had passed since the first invasion. The political turmoil that supposedly saved Europe in 1242 was long resolved. The Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire, was stable, organized, and commanded by capable generals. Nogai Khan and Talabuga. They had every advantage the first invasion possessed: mobility, tactical brilliance, composite bows, psychological warfare, and feigned retreats that had destroyed every army they'd ever faced. They also had something the first invasion lacked: detailed intelligence. They knew the terrain, the river crossings, the political divisions within Hungary. They'd studied what worked before. This should have been a massacre. Instead, it became their own. The 1285 invasion lasted barely 2 months before the Mongol army was, according to contemporary sources, almost entirely destroyed. Hungarian casualties were minimal. What had changed? Not politics, not diplomacy, not even the basic geography of Central Europe. What changed was stone. To understand what stopped the Mongols, we need to first understand what made them unstoppable everywhere else. The Mongol military system was perhaps the most sophisticated combined arms approach the medieval world had ever seen. At its core was the horse archer, a warrior who could accurately fire a composite bow at full gallop, hitting targets 300 feet away. These weren't crude arrows. They were armor-piercing bodkin points that could punch through chainmail and penetrate deep into flesh. Each Mongol warrior carried 2 bows, one for long range, one for close combat, plus 60 arrows, a saber, a lance, and sometimes a lasso for pulling knights from their horses, but the weapons were just tools. The real genius was in the system. Mongol armies were organized in decimal units. 10 soldiers formed an arban, 10 arbans formed a jagan of 100, 10 jagans formed a minyan of 1,000, and 10 minyans formed a tumen of 10,000. This wasn't just administrative convenience, it was a command and control revolution. Every unit knew its role, could operate independently, and could be coordinated through a sophisticated system of flags, drums, and mounted couriers. Even in the chaos of battle, even after suffering heavy casualties, Mongol formations maintained cohesion while European armies often dissolved into individual combats after the first charge. Their tactics were equally revolutionary. The feigned retreat, pretending to flee in disorder, only to wheel around and encircle pursuers who'd broken formation, became their signature move. It worked again and again because it violated every assumption of European military honor. Knights were trained to pursue a fleeing enemy. That's what victory looked like. They simply couldn't conceive that retreat might be deliberate, that the enemy might be leading them into an ambush with fresh units waiting on the flanks. At Mohi, Subotai executed this maneuver to perfection. The Hungarian army, confident in their defensive position along the Sayo River, watched the Mongols seemingly falter and pull back. Hungarian commanders, eager to seize the initiative, ordered a pursuit across the river. By the time they realized, the main Mongol force had circled behind them and was already crossing at multiple points using prefabricated pontoon bridges. It was too late. They were surrounded, compressed into a killing zone, and systematically annihilated by waves of arrows launched from horseback. Contemporary accounts describe Hungarian knights in full armor, pierced by so many arrows they resembled porcupines. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you fight an enemy who won't stand still, who treats honor as weakness, who turns your courage into a trap? But the Mongols had vulnerabilities that wouldn't become apparent until they pushed into terrain that didn't suit them. The entire Mongol system was built on one fundamental requirement: space. Open space for their horses to maneuver, graze, and operate at maximum efficiency. The steppes of Central Asia offered infinite room. So did the plains of Russia and, initially, the Pannonian Basin of Hungary. But Central Europe wasn't all plains. As the Mongol forces pushed westward in late 1241 and early 1242, they entered the forests of Germany, the mountains of Croatia, the river valleys where mobility became liability. Their horses, already stressed from a year of continuous campaigning, began to starve. Unlike in the steppes, where vast grasslands stretched endlessly, European forests offered limited grazing. The Mongols had burned or depopulated so many villages that foraging for supplies became increasingly difficult. Every day spent in one place meant weaker horses, which meant slower movement, which meant less tactical flexibility. The very thing that made them supreme, speed, was eroding. And then they encountered something that speed couldn't overcome: stone walls. Thick, high, professionally engineered stone fortifications that had been perfected over centuries of European warfare. The Mongols were no strangers to siege warfare. They'd conquered the most heavily fortified cities in China and Persia by absorbing local engineering expertise, building massive counterweight trebuchets, and employing psychological terror that often convinced defenders to surrender before the real assault began. But the force that invaded Europe in 1241 didn't have access to the empire's full engineering capabilities. They'd traveled light, prioritizing mobility over siege equipment. They had some portable catapults and torsion-powered stone throwers, effective against wooden palisades or earth ramparts. But against the solid stone castles of Hungary and Croatia, they might as well have been throwing pebbles. This became brutally clear at Esztergom, the ecclesiastical capital of Hungary and one of the richest cities in Central Europe. Batu Khan targeted it specifically for its wealth, gold, relics, and treasures that would fund further campaigns. The outer defenses, wooden towers and earthen ramparts, fell quickly. But when the defenders retreated to the inner citadel, a massive stone fortress, everything changed. The Mongols deployed approximately 30 siege engines and bombarded the citadel for days. The stones bounced off. They launched direct infantry assaults. The attackers were cut down by crossbow bolts fired from the ramparts. They tried fire arrows to burn the defenders out. Stone doesn't burn. After weeks of effort and mounting casualties, Batu Khan made a decision that would have been unthinkable anywhere else in the empire. He gave up. The citadel of Esztergom never fell. For an army accustomed to total victory, this was more than a tactical setback. It was a revelation. Conquering Europe wouldn't be like conquering the steppes or even China. It would require transforming their entire operational approach, bringing massive siege engines, establishing supply depots, settling in 4 months-long sieges of hundreds of castles. In other words, they'd have to stop being Mongols. The realization deepened as they pursued King Bela IV into Croatia. The Dalmatian landscape, jagged mountains, narrow valleys, coastal cliffs, was a nightmare for cavalry. Mongol columns, stretched out along mountain paths, became vulnerable to ambush. Local Croatian fighters, knowing every ridge and ravine, harassed them constantly. When the Mongols reached the fortress cities of Klis and Trogir, perched high on defensible cliffs with stone walls overlooking the Adriatic, they found themselves facing the same impossible equation: weeks of siege, heavy casualties, minimal progress. And for what? Even if they took these fortresses, 100 more just like them dotted the landscape. By spring 1242, when news of Gede's death finally reached them, it didn't create a crisis so much as provide a convenient excuse for a decision they'd already started making. This wasn't the steppes. This was a land where their greatest weapons were neutralized and their vulnerabilities exposed. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Europe didn't realize it had one. Most kingdoms were terrified the Mongols would return, and they assumed it was only political luck that had saved them. But one man understood. King Bela IV of Hungary had watched his kingdom burn, seen his army destroyed, spent months fleeing from castle to castle, hoping each stone wall would hold just one more day. And when the Mongols finally withdrew, Bela didn't celebrate. He built, between 1242 and 1300, Hungary, constructed between 147 and 172 new stone castles. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 3 new fortresses every year for 2 generations. This wasn't random construction. It was a systematic reimagining of national defense. Bela implemented a feudal policy that required any noble who wanted land grants to build a stone castle first. He effectively outsourced fortress construction to the aristocracy while maintaining strategic control over their placement. The result was a network of mutually supporting strongholds that transformed Hungary into what modern military theorists would call defense in depth. No longer would an invading force face a few major castles protecting the capital. Now, every 20 or 30 miles, they'd encounter another fortress. Each one could hold out for weeks. Each one required siege equipment, manpower, and time to reduce. And here's the strategic brilliance. The Mongols couldn't afford time. The new Hungarian fortresses incorporated every lesson learned from the invasion. They used concentric castle designs, multiple walls creating layers of defense, so that even if attackers breached the outer wall, they'd be trapped in a killing zone between walls with defenders raining projectiles from above. They added moats, artificial lakes, and water obstacles that cavalry couldn't easily cross. They built projecting towers and galleries that eliminated blind spots, allowing defenders to fire down on anyone trying to dig under or scale the walls. And they standardized the use of crossbows. This weapon, often overlooked in the romance of medieval warfare, was arguably the single most important tactical innovation against Mongol tactics. Unlike the English longbow, which required years of training and constant practice, a crossbow could be taught to a peasant or merchant in a matter of days. It had mechanical advantages the composite bow couldn't match. The crossbow locked its string in place, allowing the shooter to aim carefully at full draw without muscle fatigue. Its bolts, called quarrels, were shorter, thicker, and heavier than arrows. They couldn't be fired as rapidly, but in a defensive position, rate of fire mattered less than penetrating power and accuracy, and quarrels were devastatingly effective. Modern tests on period-accurate replicas show that crossbow bolts could punch through a millimeter of steel plate at close range. Against Mongol lamellar armor, leather and small metal plates laced together, they were even more effective. European defenders learned a simple rule that reversed the entire tactical calculus. Don't aim for the rider, aim for the horse. A Mongol on horseback was the most dangerous warrior in the medieval world. A Mongol on foot was just another light infantryman, poorly armored and vulnerable. By targeting horses, defenders could neutralize Mongol mobility and force them into the kind of static close-quarters fighting where European heavy infantry excelled. Combined with obstacles like the chevaux de frise, portable wooden frames covered in sharpened stakes that could be rolled into position to block cavalry charges, and the defensive advantages multiplied. The Mongols had built an empire on speed, shock, and psychological dominance. Stone walls, crossbow bolts, and field obstacles stripped away all three. So when Nogai Khan and Talabuga led the second invasion in 1285, they weren't facing the same kingdom that had collapsed in 1241. They were facing a fortress state designed specifically to defeat them. The invasion began confidently. The Mongols used their traditional tactics, feigned retreats, rapid flanking maneuvers, probing attacks to find weak points. But everywhere they turned, they found stone. fortresses that refused to fall, supply lines that couldn't sustain prolonged sieges, and winter approaching. The campaign, expected to last months or even years, collapsed within 8 weeks. As the Mongol forces retreated through the Carpathian passes, Hungarian cavalry and infantry harassed them relentlessly. Contemporary Hungarian chronicles describe the Mongol army as being almost entirely destroyed, with only a remnant making it back to the Golden Horde's territories. It was one of the most complete reversals in military history. The army that had terrorized Europe, that had seemed invincible, had been systematically dismantled, not by a superior cavalry force or a brilliant general, but by architecture. There's a letter that survived in the Hungarian Royal Archives, written by a local administrator in 1287, 2 years after the second invasion. It's mundane, mostly about tax collection and repair work on a castle damaged during the Mongol attack. But there's one line that captures everything. The walls held. It says simply, "The walls held, and so we remain." That sentence, unremarkable in its bureaucratic plainness, represents one of the most profound strategic insights in medieval history. You don't defeat a superior mobile force by matching its mobility. You defeat it by making mobility irrelevant. You create conditions where speed becomes a disadvantage, where the enemy's strengths turn into liabilities, where the very thing that makes them dominant everywhere else fails utterly against you. The Mongols never returned to Central Europe after 1285, not because they'd lost interest, not because of political distractions, but because the cost-benefit analysis no longer made sense. Conquering China or Persia, even with heavily fortified cities, offered concentrated wealth worth the investment in siege equipment and time. But Europe? Hundreds of castles spread across difficult terrain, each requiring weeks or months to reduce, for kingdoms that weren't necessarily wealthier than what they already controlled. The math didn't work. The secret weapon that humiliated the Mongols wasn't a sword or a bow or a revolutionary piece of battlefield technology. It was patience solidified into stone. It was the recognition that against an enemy who won through speed and terror, the ultimate answer was something that didn't move, didn't panic, and couldn't be intimidated. It was the understanding that defense isn't about matching your enemies' strengths, but about forcing them to fight on your terms in conditions where their advantages evaporate. And perhaps most importantly, it was the willingness to learn from catastrophe, to take the worst defeat in a nation's history and transform it into a systematic restructuring of how defense itself was conceived. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, an empire built on horses and movement and the absolute mastery of open spaces, was ultimately stopped not by armies or alliances, but by walls. By the simple ancient art of stacking stones high enough and thick enough that even the greatest warriors on earth couldn't pass. The walls didn't fight. They didn't maneuver. They didn't need to. They simply stood. And that was enough.